Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar on the Tijuana sewage crisis. I am Phillip Musegaas. I'm the executive director at San Diego Coastkeeper, and I'm really happy to have you all with us today. So, what we're going to do today is give you kind of a Tijuana border pollution crisis 101. We'd like to just kind of go through some of the history, talk about what the pollution impacts are, what the sources of the pollution are, and to give you a sense of kind of what Coastkeeper is doing to address this, the work we're doing with our partners at in Tijuana. We're very, very fortunate to have to work with a Tijuana nonprofit group called Proyecto Fronterizo de Educación Ambiental, or PIFEA. They also include the Tijuana Waterkeepers. They're our fellow waterkeeper in this region. And and yeah, we're excited to kind of share this information. One thing I want to talk about a little bit at the outset is, this issue gets a lot of public attention. There's a lot of media attention on it over the past couple of years, especially. And sometimes there's some bad information that gets out there, not quite the right facts. Sometimes there's blame placed on one country or the other, or discussion of sources of pollution, where the pollution is coming from, that can create confusion and not really represent what's actually going on. So one of our basic goals today, is to just give you that good information, to talk about, here's the agreement between these two countries. Here's who is doing what to solve this crisis. Here's what's happening right now. We're going to give you our most recent updates we can. This is a very fast changing, kind of fast evolving situation. So, what I tell you about today, by the end of the week, things may have improved or not improved, depending on what's been happening. So, with that, I'm going to dive in. Um, Go to our first slide. So you do it here. I got it. Sorry. Go ahead. So I'm going to start out today with just talking about the watershed. And so essentially, I I would bet most of you know what a watershed is, but just to give you a quick recap, watershed is a geographic area that basically has all the drainage that flows into a particular river or water body. And so what we're looking at now on the map is the Tijuana River watershed. And I think one of the first things you'll notice, there's a couple takeaways here. One of the first things is you'll see that most of the watershed, about 75% of it, is in Mexico. It goes up into the mountains in Baja California Norte. Um, and a chunk, about 25%, is in the US, which reaches all the way up to Cuyamaca, all the way up into the mountains, and then flows down into the Tijuana estuary. The other thing I would point out is that little red area that you see to the kind of middle left side of the screen, left corner of the screen, is the Tijuana estuary. So that is where this entire watershed kind of comes together. That's the confluence of all these different streams that make up the Tijuana River watershed. And the main stem of the river crosses the border from Mexico to the US, just east of the estuary, and then flows through the Tijuana estuary, uh, through the city of Imperial Beach and out to the ocean. The mouth of the Tijuana River is just south of Imperial Beach, in a national wildlife refuge and protected space that we're going to talk about a little later in more detail. Um, so a couple things to think about when you're looking at this. One is, we have a watershed that crosses the international border. Of course, the border is a political entity, right? It's a line on a map. Unfortunately, it's a wall now across a good stretch of this territory. Um, but the natural environment doesn't honor borders, right? Natural environment and water especially does what it wants to do. It flows where it wants to flow. And so, we have the Tijuana River naturally flowing north into the US and then flowing into the ocean. Um, and I think what this shows to me, as a clean water advocate, looking at this watershed, it's really important to note that if we have pollution challenges in this entire watershed, we need to work on them binationally. We need a combined collaborative approach. The US can't do it on its own, and certainly Mexico can't do it on its own. And so that's why cooperation and collaboration and a clear plan for both countries is so important. Um, and I think the other thing I would note is that, again, as you see that little red area on the screen, the confluence of all this different parts of this watershed is in the U.S., is in the Tijuana estuary. And so a lot of the pollution that we are going to talk about today and that many of you are aware of is kind of concentrated at this in this last stretch of the river before it goes into the ocean. Um, Partly because the river flows through the city of Tijuana before it gets into the U.S., and a number of other reasons as well. So I will move on. And so just kind of an overview of the talk today. We're talking about, again, a binational challenge, and just want to go through a few of the reasons for it, both the reasons for this problem, the impacts that this pollution is having on us, on our communities and on our environment. And then we'll get into later kind of how is this being addressed and how can we all participate collectively as members of this community to move to move towards progress and more progress more quickly. Excuse me. This is really when if there's one takeaway from my talk today that I'd love for you all to have, it is that this most of this problem is basically a problem of poorly maintained and underfunded infrastructure. And I know if your eyes glaze over when I say the word infrastructure, that's okay. But that basically means, we have a system, we have a physical system along both in Tijuana and in the US that was built goes back to the mid 20th century and 1990s. Basically was designed and built to collect sewage, all the sanitary sewage and industrial wastewater in Tijuana, collect all that in Tijuana in Mexico, and then transport all that untreated wastewater both to a wastewater treatment plant in Tijuana, just south of the city, and to a larger plant in the US, just right at the border with Mexico. So the idea was we collect the sewage in Tijuana, we pump it, we transport it to these two treatment plants, and in an ideal world, all of that wastewater would be treated, and then when that treated wastewater is discharged into the ocean from both of those plants, it has very low or no contamination in it, right? It's meeting all public permit requirements, federal and Mexico Clean Water Act requirements, and it's not having an impact. That's what the system was designed to do. Unfortunately, what we have is a system, excuse me, that is uh, has been poorly maintained, has not been funded properly, and so what we've seen, especially over the last 5 years, is this accumulation of deferred maintenance and of lack of attention to this physical system, to the sewer pipes and pump stations and wastewater treatment plants, is a system that's failing. And that's in Mexico, most of that failure relates to their collection system and to their small sewage treatment plant, which is called San Antonio de los Buenos. So you hear me say San Antonio de los Buenos or SAB. That's the acronym we like to use. When I say that, I'm talking about the treatment plant in Mexico. That plant basically stopped functioning properly over 10 years ago, and so has was a big source because it wasn't treating the sewage being pumped to it. That sewage and that wastewater is being discharged and diverted directly into the Pacific Ocean, just south of Tijuana. Um, a similar situation happened here in the US with what's called the South Bay International Treatment Plant or the South Bay plant. That's the wastewater treatment plant on the border with Mexico in the US. That plant didn't completely fail, but it came very close to failing over the last up to about 2 years ago. It was not treating the wastewater flowing to it properly, and it was discharging barely treated wastewater out into the ocean about 3 miles off of Imperial Beach. And so this this kind of infrastructure failure is what's caused the beach closures that we've had in Imperial Beach. We have, unfortunately, the beach in IB has been closed for about 3 years running. I think over 3 years now, with a few exceptions a day here and there. But we have beach closures that affect the communities and affect the people who live in these communities and want to use their beach and want to enjoy their own environment and have a right to a clean environment. Unfortunately, not having that. Um, just to shift to that, so all of this, we have untreated waste flowing into the Pacific Ocean south of Tijuana. We have up until recently um, poorly treated sewage from the South Bay treatment plant. And then kind of a third source is the river itself. And so the Tijuana River, as it flows through Tijuana and then crosses the border into the US, unfortunately, um, there are a number of sources of untreated sewage and industrial wastewater that either are discharged directly or that leak into the Tijuana River itself in Mexico. And so when we see the flow of the river crossing the border and coming through the Tijuana River estuary and the Tijuana River Valley, that flow of water is often a large portion of that is actually untreated wastewater, especially during the summer months, because the Tijuana River, like many rivers in our climate in Southern California and in this Mediterranean desert climate that we have, uh, under normal circumstances, excuse me, um, the river would be nearly dry or not flowing at all during summer months, during the dry portions of the year. And so, what we've seen the past few years, off and on, and more often than not, is high flows uh, of water in the high volumes of water flowing through the Tijuana River, flowing out to the ocean, flowing through the Tijuana River Valley, and a large portion, a large volume of that river flow is actually wastewater, and that is what's leading to and contributing to the beach closures and the public health impacts that we see in our border communities. And in Tijuana, we certainly have in Playas de Tijuana, where people go to the beach, um, they often don't have the same up-to-date information on water quality. And so unfortunately, the coastal waters at Playas de Tijuana are also often polluted and often present a public health risk. So we have the health risk impact from the water, from contaminated coastal marine waters at our beaches. And in the Tijuana River Valley here in the US, we also have um, an ongoing impact and in some ways a growing impact from the air impacts of the river flow. And so what we're seeing is as the Tijuana River flows through the Tijuana River Valley, there is one location in particular that we call the Saturn Boulevard hotspot, where the river actually flows over kind of a drop. So you have a waterfall essentially, I mean, roughly an 8 to 10 foot kind of waterfall effect. The river flows under a road and then flows over a drop, and that drop creates aerosolization. That causes the river water to create a lot of foam. It creates a lot of spray, and that is picked up and carried in the air itself and dispersed to the local community, right? If you live near the ocean, if there's a marine layer, right, that you can smell the ocean, that you're breathing in particulates from the ocean. In this case, people who live near the Tijuana River in San Isidro and Imperial Beach and the Nestor communities are dealing with contaminated air that has hydrogen sulfide sewer gases, that has other pollutants that are picked up and aerosolized. And we are just starting to understand that that is causing long-term impacts. There's a lot of anecdotal and public health evidence there showing that people are suffering chronic impacts from everything from migraine headaches to nausea to gastrointestinal illness from not from going surfing, not from going swimming in water that's polluted, but simply from living in this community that's near the river. And to give you a sense of the risks here, just before I move on to some other things, the Saturn Boulevard hotspot, this one spot on the river, that location and that which creates a lot of these sewer gases that are so impactful to people, that is less than a mile from three different public elementary schools. So we're not just talking about people in their homes. We're talking about people where the kids don't want to go outside or the school teachers aren't letting the kids go out during recess because the air is not really safe to breathe. That I know to me that's an unacceptable situation. That's an outrageous situation in this day and age. But that's something we are dealing with and our communities are dealing with. Also just want to talk about the ecological impacts. We focus, of course, on the public health impacts here and the public health risks. But the ecological impacts of this long-term pollution are also significant. And what we see in the Tijuana River estuary is over the long term, we see kind of fundamental changes to the estuary that are affecting how it functions. And so typically a coastal estuary like this is a coastal has coastal wetlands, has tidal marshes, has all kinds of ecological and environmental benefits to the species that use it. So it provides nursery habitat for ocean fish that come in and spawn, and they're young fish live in that coastal marsh until they're big enough to go out in the ocean. There's tremendous biodiversity and bird life that rely on a clean estuary to feed and to nest and do other things. Um, and unfortunately, what we've seen is because of both the polluted flow of the river and also large flows of sediment across the border. So just because of construction and because of other reasons in Tijuana and along the border, we see large amounts of sediment that gets carried by stormwater, that get by rainfall and get carried into the Tijuana River Valley. And if you put enough sediment into a system like this, it starts to fill up, right? It starts to change from a coastal marshy estuary to it starts to fill in. It starts to create kind of more dry land, more areas where the habitat itself is being modified and not in good ways. And so, and the other thing we see is if you have a river flow that has very high levels of bacteria and pollution, that also will probably have very low levels of dissolved oxygen. And marine life and aquatic life needs oxygen, needs a minimum levels of oxygen in the water to survive. And unfortunately, we've seen in the Tijuana River estuary large periods of time during the summer, during warmer months, where the dissolved oxygen levels in the estuary in the river are very low to almost non-existent. So we're looking at times of the year when the estuary just can't really support that basic marine life and that natural life that we needed to support. And that, the whole reason we protected this estuary many years ago and created this wildlife refuge and we set this land aside was because of its value ecologically. And so as we move towards solutions and as we start to see progress, we also need to think about, and I think it's helps us to think about, how are we going to restore this estuary once we reduce this pollution? How do we get the estuary back to a healthy, functioning, natural ecosystem that can support a lot of life that that I think we value. We value birds and fish and marine mammals and all these things that make our coast here in San Diego and in the Cali Baja region so attractive and so valuable to us. And then last thing I want to highlight here before I go on is, of course, the environmental justice and the access impacts of this. I mentioned this a little bit before, but there's because of the pollution offshore, we've seen years, literally years of beach closures because of high levels of bacteria in the water. It's not safe to go in a water body when it has high levels of bacteria because it exposes you to a much higher risk of gastrointestinal illness, infections, and things like that we obviously want to avoid. Um, the environmental justice aspects of this are very clear when you look at in the US, you look at the communities near the border in South County, San Diego. These are primarily communities of color, community Latino majority population communities. And so they are being disproportionately affected by this pollution. The beaches and the public resources that these communities have that should be clean and safe for them to use are polluted and unusable. And so you contrast that with what you see in North County, San Diego, and Pacific Beach and Mission Beach and La Jolla, where the beaches and the water quality is often good. And it's safe to go to the beach, safe to use those resources. So those communities are not dealing with this pollution. This pollution is heavily impacting people who live in South County, and that's when we think about how long this problem has been going on, it was really important to think about kind of why has this not been solved? Is it because of certainly because of politics, but is it because the voices in this community have not been listened to and have not been heard as they should have been? All right, I'm going to keep moving. We got a lot to talk about. Don't worry. I know, don't get alarmed when you see this map. Um, so I'm going to show you this map because this kind of gives you a sense, and it's great to kind of go back and look at this in more detail, but this basically shows this sewage collection and treatment system that I was talking about when we started the talk. Essentially, what we're looking at here is we have the collection system in Mexico that has a series of major pump stations that either pump the wastewater to the San Antonio de los Buenos plant, which is kind of in the left-hand corner of your screen, or the waste is pumped across the border to this South Bay treatment plant, the International Treatment Plant, which is kind of right up, kind of top center in your map. And if this system has breakdowns, especially with the pump stations, you see this PBC station in the kind of right-hand side of the screen. These pump stations are critical to making sure that this system functions properly. And when they're not operating, if they break down, if the pipes that transport the sewage between them collapse or spring a leak, then you have a breakdown in the system that typically leads to untreated wastewater being diverted either into the Tijuana River and then flowing into the US and the estuary, or you have that untreated flow being diverted out to the San Antonio plant and out to the ocean. So I'm going to leave you there with that. I encourage you to go back and look at this map a little closer. It kind of really gives you a sense of, how the system is supposed to work. All right. Again, don't be alarmed by the flow chart. I'm going to run through this pretty quickly, but I wanted to kind of talk briefly about the history here and the agreements that were made between the U.S. and Mexico, because I think this is so important to understanding this problem. Um, you know, the question of how to manage water resources along the border obviously has been around a long time, right? We have a long history of between Mexico and the U.S. Back in 1889, the International Boundary Commission, which was the precursor of what we have now, was established, and that was primarily focused on kind of making sure the border was honored, looking at where the river crossed the border, things like that, kind of basic land use kind of restrictions. In the 1940s, when they started to see more pollution because the city of Tijuana was starting to grow, the city of San Diego during the Second World War certainly saw a population boom and became much larger. Then that initial treaty created the International Boundary Water Commission, the IBWC, which includes the US side of IBWC and also the what we call SILA, Comisión Internacional de Límites y Aguas. Those two agencies are supposed to work together to kind of manage these water resources at the border. And the big step that happened, I think, again, from this slide, the big takeaway here is there was a big step forward in the 1990s when, again, we saw growing populations, growing urbanization that led to increased water pollution that required a more treatment at the border. And so there was cooperation between the two countries, and there was funding in the US to build the South Bay treatment plant that we've talked about a little bit. That plant was built initially to have a 25 million gallons a day capacity. They thought that was enough treatment capacity at the time to deal with the pollution. And then there was also the San Antonio plant in Tijuana, which was functioning and operating to treat some of the sewage there. Between the 1990s and 2018, 2020, what we saw was a kind of a breakdown of that infrastructure, right? We saw this combination of increasing population, increasing pressure and stress on this wastewater infrastructure, combined with a lack of funding and a lack of attention and a lack of maintenance. And that, of course, just like if your house or your car, if you don't maintain it well, it's not going to keep functioning well. And so we saw increased pollution, increased accidents. So there were some huge sewage spills in the I think 2018 to 2020 period, and that that really kind of brought this attention back to this issue and the fact that just building these treatment plants wasn't enough. They weren't being maintained. I think there was a dawning realization these treatment plants were not big enough to handle all of the wastewater. And so that led to litigation, that led to more funding being diverted or being dedicated to expanding the treatment capacity in the US. Um, and that's led to the last 3 to 5 years of, again, this combination of new funding being put in place, new plans being put in place at the same time as increased breakdowns, increased pollution, and just huge volumes of pollution, unfortunately, getting into the ocean, getting into the river, and kind of creating these public health impacts that I talked about earlier, creating these additional this long-term beach closure that we've had at Imperial Beach, which has just negatively affected people who live there, certainly for obvious reasons. Um, and then within the last couple of years, we've seen some momentum in the other direction. We've seen increased funding. We've seen a new amendment to the treaty between the two countries to treat more sewage and to make plans to actually fix this problem. So things are going in the right direction, but they're going slowly. And so I think that is where where the rest of my time here, I just want to talk about what progress is being made, what we have done, and kind of how we continue to move forward. The other thing I want to highlight while we're talking about treaties and agreements is a very fundamental thing, which I want, again, one of my takeaways for you all is under a treaty between the US and Mexico, the US agreed to treat the majority of the sewage generated in Tijuana. Um, and that's what the South Bay treatment plant was built to do. That's why the South Bay treatment plant is being expanded, being doubled in size to treat more of the sewage. And so there was an agreement where the US would take on a lot of this burden. And at the same time, Mexico's commitment was to maintain that whole collection system, to maintain its own plant, and to make sure that there wasn't pollution getting into the environment of Mexico that wasn't making it to the treatment system, that was getting out in the environment. So as we know that those commitments haven't entirely been met, which brings us where we are today. So we talked about the public health impacts a little bit. I think I've talked about a lot of this actually. Just a couple photos kind of showing that. The photo at the top left there it's a little hard to tell, but what I'm looking at, what I'm pointing to there is the huge amounts of sediment that flow through the canyons that cross the border, that come into the Tijuana River Valley, and that just basically fill up what used to be coastal marsh and wetland with dirt, basically. When I say sediment, it's a nice way of saying dirt from highway construction, dirt from poor erosion management in Mexico and along the border. That creates this flow of sediment that is kind of starting to choke off the estuary and have these environmental impacts. The photo at the bottom left there is the Saturn Boulevard hotspot that's showing you where that flows under the road and creates this foam. And so, what we're seeing is public health impacts, um, uh, ecological impacts, and public access impacts. I'm not a surfer, but I understand from surfers that Imperial Beach, that line of coast has some of the best breaks in the whole region. And so, people can't safely use that public resource. We are here in California, especially, uh, we have public trust resources like our coast, like our beaches, like our marine waters that are supposed to be held in trust and supposed to be maintained and protected for the use of all of us, not just those of us in La Jolla, but all of us along the coast, all of us in California. So that's what we're seeing here, and that's what we need to address. And just again, a few more points about this. Tijuana estuary, I talked about a little bit. It's a really valuable resource that we want to protect, that we want to restore. Um, there's also a marine protected area off the mouth of the Tijuana River. So there's a 1 square mile area out in the ocean where the river flows into the ocean that the state of California over 10 years ago decided was worth protecting with additional kind of regulations on fishing, on removing resources from that area. So that's, we see these things on paper that, these uh, additional designations of the estuary, of the marine protected area offshore, showing that we value these areas ecologically. They have a lot of value. They help to climate resiliency and biodiversity functions. Um, so we need to get back to that, right? We need to find a way to make those protections that are just right now just on paper. We need to make sure they mean something in the long run. Also, Friendship Park. I don't want to neglect to talk about Friendship Park, which has historically been a park along the border where people from both sides of the border, families could get together and talk across the border and meet across the border. Um, that park, there's some great plans underway. There's a fantastic group called Friends of Friendship Park that is working on reopening the park, trying to make the park as functional as possible, despite the fact that the border wall goes through the middle of it. So that's, there are social aspects to these pollution problems as well, because because of pollution and flood damage, the park has been closed to the public for a long time. So we're hoping to change that. This is just a very quick snapshot. I love maps, so you'll have to humor me and having a lot of maps in this presentation. But the reason I included this, again, is kind of some things to think about after this presentation is over, is this map is showing all the different political jurisdictions in the Tijuana River Valley. So, um, this, to me, as a clean water advocate and as someone who works on regulations and legislation, the fact that we have so many different political jurisdictions, we have the federal government, we have the city of Imperial Beach, the city of San Diego, the county of San Diego, all owning little bits and pieces of this valley. We have California state parks. That makes developing a cleanup plan and restoration plans much more challenging when you have this kind of diffused ownership and authority over land use. You can see the Tijuana River flowing through there. The kind of blue dotted lines show where the river channel is. And so when we look to the future and we think about restoring this area once we've reduced the pollution, we really need to think about how do we get these different political entities to work together in a really collaborative way to protect these resources. And I'm going to run through the last couple slides pretty quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions. Um, this is maybe one of the most important slides in here and the information that I want to share with you. So, I'm telling you about all these problems, telling you about all this pollution. What are we doing about it? I think that's one thing another takeaway I want to have for you today. Coastkeeper has taken a range of different actions, I think, to address this. We've been involved in this issue for about 2.5 years now. And the one major thing I want to highlight to begin with is our partnership with PFEA. I know there are some folks from staff from PFEA on the call today, and I really appreciate them coming. We have a project underway with PFEA to establish what we're calling the One Coastal Community website. So we've created a website. You'll see the logo behind me, and we'll share links to that as part of our package here with the webinar today. That website is a place where we're going to house water quality data, public meeting data, data about the repairs and the upgrades to the infrastructure. So our goal with this is to really create a hub of information that people in Tijuana and people in the US and in San Diego can use to find out what's going on with these border pollution issues. Because we feel like this is a binational issue. This is not just a US or Mexico issue. And the more we can communicate and share good information across the border, the better we're going to be uh, in order to move towards solutions. Um, uh, Coastkeeper also has a community science role in this problem. We have been collecting water samples in the Tijuana River since November of 2024. We're going to be coming out with a report in the next couple of months, kind of summarizing what that water quality looks like. The map you see on the bottom right shows where we collect water samples. And we're also collaborating with PFEA because they have been collecting water samples along the beaches and playas for many, many years. So we're going to have all this data up on the One Coastal Community website for the public to see, for academic researchers, really for anyone who wants to use this data. It's open source, and we want to share it with the public and make it available. Coastkeeper has also taken a number of legal actions to try and compel quicker action on this pollution issues. We filed a lawsuit in the US against the South Bay treatment plant. We saw big success with that. Within a year of our lawsuit, the plant was back operating back within legal limits and treating its wastewater fully in compliance with the law. So we really have seen progress there. And we just recently filed a submission against Mexico under the bilateral trade treaty that we talked about a little bit today, to put some public diplomatic pressure on Mexico to address their own shortcomings when it comes to investing in their infrastructure, repairing their infrastructure, and really reducing this pollution, expanding their treatment capacity, all of these things. So just a quick snapshot. I've talked about some of this, but what's happening right now, as in probably the last 6 months or so, we have seen progress. So again, I feel like the momentum is there. We are seeing things starting to take shape that will reduce this pollution. And we're hopeful in the next 1 to 2 years, we're really going to see progress and see a change. There's new agreements between the US and Mexico on expanding the South Bay treatment plant. There are accelerated deadlines for repairs in Mexico that are supposed to address these infrastructure challenges. We have a new amendment to the treaty called Minute 333, which puts in place some better financing mechanisms, because with a big infrastructure problem like this that we have binationally, as you can imagine, one of the biggest challenges is finding the funding, finding the public funding at the federal level in the US and in Mexico to pay for these repairs, to pay for these upgrades. So this is a step in the right direction in making sure that money gets to where it's needed to fix these systems. There's also consideration studies that are going to be underway to look at expanding that treatment plant in Mexico, as well as expanding the one here in the South, but in the US. Because one of the challenges we have long term is, even when we build under the current plans that we have, even when we build the additional treatment capacity that's funded now and that's on paper to be built, that's still not enough to treat all of the sewage that's being generated. So we still have an issue of about 25 to 30 million gallons of wastewater that, if we don't build more treatment capacity, is going to continue to flow into the ocean and cause problems. San Diego County, there's a lot of work underway by county supervisors and Supervisor Aguirre to fund a fix over the next 2 years to fix that polluted waterfall that causes all these public health impacts I talked about. And a lot of public health studies underway to really take a look at, what is being, how is the public being affected, both short and long term, for the people living near the river. What's the impact of breathing and being exposed to hydrogen sulfide gases for such a long time. I'm going to just end here with some future ideas. This is hopefully will spur some discussion, but when we think about the fact that we're finally feel like we're making progress, that their planning is being put in place to increase treatment, to reduce pollution, then we start to think about, okay, once we get this pollution under control, what do we want this region to look like? How are we going to handle looking at the long-term health impacts, looking at the economic impacts, because there have been severe economic impacts to people living and working in Imperial Beach and other South County communities. And certainly we don't know what the impacts in Playa de Tijuana are in terms of economics. And also on a fundamental ecological level, environmental level, we have this amazing natural resource, the Tijuana River estuary, how do we want to restore that? What are our goals when it comes to like, how do we get that back to a system that's functioning and healthy and supporting wildlife and supporting biodiversity? What is that going to cost? How long is that going to take? These are the these are kind of for clean water advocates like myself, these are the fun questions that we think about when we start to see some solutions taking shape. Again, they're taking a long time and we need more action more quickly, but when we start to see these things start to fall into place, how do we get how do we get our natural system to be restored and most importantly, how do we make sure that these systems going forward, this whole wastewater collection treatment system, make sure that's maintained and make sure that continues to function properly into the future because we don't want to be back here in 20 years talking about how we made all this progress in 2026, but then we let it all deteriorate again. We are determined, I think, as advocates here, not to see that happen. We want to see solutions happen, and we want to see permanent progress. Just some shots of the river here. This is our water quality monitoring team. That's an aerial shot of the Tijuana River mouth, unfortunately, during a very polluted episode flowing into the ocean. And shots of the border. You can see where the border wall extends right on literally into the ocean between our two countries. So I will end there. Thank you so much. I know we've got about 15 minutes left, it looks like. So we're going to go into Q&A session. Just a reminder, if you have a question, you can type your question using the Q&A button, or you can use the raise your hand feature if you'd rather just ask your question orally, and we can unmute you so you can ask your question then. All right. So we have a question from Laurie Silvan. Hola, Laurie. Should I read the question? Okay. So I'm just going to read the question back. It's evident that these binational treaties agreements address the contaminated water coming from the wastewater treatment plants, expanding and improving them. However, do they also address the polluted water flowing into the estuary and the ocean through the river itself? And if so, how is this being addressed? Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So the question here really is, how, if even if we have increased treatment, if we have polluted water in the river itself, how do we deal with that? We are making some progress with that already. Over the past 6 months or so, on the US side, the IBWC actually put in additional treatment capacity at the South Bay treatment plant. So they went from 25 million gallons a day up to 35 million gallons. The goal of this and the idea of increasing treatment at the South Bay plant is the more wastewater that plant can treat, then the more water can be diverted from the river itself to be sent for treatment. And so the idea there is that additional 10 million gallons a day is water that would otherwise be flowing in the river and flowing into the estuary is being pumped to the treatment plant and being treated properly and being discharged in the ocean. So the key to really reducing or eliminating that polluted river flow is to divert that wastewater before it ever gets in the river channel, send it to treatment either in the US or Mexico, and just avoid that whole issue. Because again, as we if the natural system here, the natural river flow in the Tijuana River during dry summer months, we would not see much flow at all, and so we wouldn't have this constant kind of flow of wastewater going through the valley. Next question, I think, from Anonymous. Are there interim fixes that could reduce aerosolization at Saturn Boulevard in the short term while upstream treatment work is underway? Yes, absolutely. So again, similar to what's happening with the treatment of the river water, the County of San Diego has a plan. They've just announced or they've just decided on a plan to over the next 1 to 2 years. We're hoping it's going to be closer to 1 year. They're going to basically build additional pipes to capture the water that's flowing under that road and flowing over that waterfall that I showed you in that one photo. to capture that water, extending pipes under the road to carry that water further downstream before it actually enters the river channel. And that will basically eliminate that open waterfall aerosolization foaming effect. Um, so we are very supportive of that. The county has funding to do that. I think the challenge is getting that done quickly. And again, this is where this jurisdiction question comes in because um, the county of San Diego has the funding and owns some of the land around there, but the city of San Diego actually owns the road, and the U.S. Navy, believe it or not, owns the river land on either side of the road and downstream. And so we need to make sure the Navy and the city of San Diego are cooperating and making this process as quick as possible. Because ideally, we'd like to see these new pipes be attached and added and functioning as obviously as quickly as possible. And 2 years to us sounds too long. So part of our advocacy is gonna be to push for a quicker implementation of that project. There's a great question about what can people do to get involved and help. So I think the first basic step is just to become informed. I'm getting some great questions, so I get the sense that a lot of you really know this issue pretty well. But just continue to, go to our website, PFEA's website, the One Coastal Community site. If you can spare the time, the next time there is an IBWC public meeting, which happen a few times a year, come to that public meeting, make sure your voice is heard. At the state level, it's very, very important to talk to your state lawmakers, so your state legislators, your assembly person, your state senator. In South County, that's Senator Steve Padilla, Assembly Member Alvarez, Assembly Member Vargas. These folks are key to continuing to pressure the federal government, to continuing to work with the county to find funding. They really are, and they've all been doing a lot of good work. Also, the county supervisors, San Diego County supervisors, Supervisor Aguirre, Supervisor Lawson Reamer, let them know that you want to see change and you want to see quick solutions to these problems. That's really the best way you can get involved now. You can also talk to your congressional reps. I think unfortunately, the current state of Congress makes it difficult to get things done. But Congressman Scott Peters has been really fantastic in being a leading voice in the House about trying to get more funding. Um, to address these larger infrastructure problems. So, contact Scott Peters' office if you're in his district, contact Sarah Jacobs' office and tell them this issue is important to you because the the biggest thing, outside of the universe of politics and the lack of funding, the biggest thing that works against us or that can work against us is a lack of attention. And if these lawmakers don't hear about this issue from you from their constituents, then they're not going to prioritize it. So we need to beat the drum on this and continue to talk about at a personal level, an individual level about how important it is to fix this as quickly as possible and to protect our neighbors and our communities from this pollution. All right, one more question. Um, this one, okay.
Read that.
What can concerned members of the community do to support and or get involved with Coastkeeper's efforts? Fantastic question. So, I think, the best way to stay informed on what we're doing is to sign up for our newsletter and to follow us on social media. So we have a really great Instagram account. We send a newsletter out monthly. It's we don't send a ton of emails, so don't worry about being bombarded, but you can sign up for the newsletter. We send people to our website.
On our website.
Yeah, go to our website. It's pretty easy to find. The slide that's up right now has our Facebook and Instagram and YouTube handles on there. My email is on here and my phone number. Please feel free to contact me and happy to get these things going. But yeah, sign up for our newsletters and you'll you'll be in the groove. Coach Jackson, thank you. So Coach Jackson is saying we are working to create more accessible communication on our platforms. seeing if you and your staff and your Mexican partners have any suggestions in terms of translations, etc. So that's a fantastic question. I think we continue to kind of evolve in how we're trying to kind of figure out the best way to communicate what we're doing in English and Spanish. Today we're using the Zoom kind of translation caption feature, which is available on if you have a Zoom account on through the Zoom webinar and Zoom regular Zoom meeting accounts, you can set that up. It's not perfect. I think you know, as you can see if you've been reading the captions, there are some things don't get translated easily. We also, when we're doing in-person meetings, community meetings, we will hire a translator to come and offer translation services when we're doing that. Um, Ideally, if we continue to have these even public virtual meetings, it's ideally you have someone you have a translator that's on live, kind of helping with that translation. So uh, I think we'd be happy to follow up and share the resources we have on this with you if you want to reach out to us. We have another question from Karen Royer. It says, we have hydrogen sulfide problems in the creeks that feed into the Chesapeake Bay, but we don't have a number that would trigger warnings to the communities about the airborne gas issue. Do you have a critical upper limit for airborne hydrogen sulfide for humans? This is a great question. It's a little wonky, but it's a fantastic question. So essentially the question in here is at what level do these sewer gases that we talk about, these hydrogen sulfide gases, at what level, if you're monitoring the air quality, right, what level does it become unhealthy for people? Unfortunately, in California and in the US, there is not a federal or widely accepted standard for how much hydrogen sulfide can be in the air before it causes a health impact. The numbers that we use typically, if you're monitoring air, and we have air monitoring happening here in San Diego and in the River Valley now by the Air Pollution Control District. But if you're monitoring the air, if you have above 30 parts per billion of hydrogen sulfide gas, then you are starting to it's discernible, right? You can detect it. It smells like it's this very strong rotten egg smell, sulfurous smell. Um, Above 30 ppb, you can start to smell it. It can start to give you a headache. When you go up from there, I think above 100, it's perceived to start to have more kind of, can make you nauseated, can give you more health impacts. But um, one of the things State Senator Padilla, I think, has introduced legislation to set a public health standard, a clear standard that is, below that standard is safe and above that standard starts to become a health issue. But we know that above uh, 30 parts per billion can start to be harmful. Again, harmful in the short term in terms of, if you're outside in your yard and you're smelling this strong sulfurous rotten egg smell, you don't want to be out there. You're going to start to feel ill after a few minutes. Um, that's why, for example, when our sampling team goes out and collects water samples, at that Saturn Boulevard hotspot, we wear respirators to make sure we keep our staff safe. The people that live nearby, that live a quarter mile away or a third of a mile away, you know, they should not have to wear a respirator when they go outside their house. That's insane. Um, so we're working to set a clear standard, but that's certainly what the current standards are. And just to give you a sense of the context, these current standards, these numbers I've talked about, those were originally set for sewage treatment plant workers because the idea was, well, people in the general public should never be exposed to hydrogen sulfide, so why would we need a standard for it? Let's just set like an OSHA standard for treatment plant workers to make sure they're kept safe. But this crisis, this issue we're talking about highlights that why we need those standards for everyone. We're just take one more. I think we'll take one more question. I know we're down in the last couple minutes. So there's a question about, I'll just read it for you. I saw an article recently about the ozone nanobubbler in the Tijuana River. Is this kind of technology a feasible solution? And what exactly would it be aiding? So that's a great question. There was a lot of news a few months ago about IBWC, the federal government here in the US, trying out a pilot project or testing out a system where they installed what are called ozone nanobubblers. Basically, they installed equipment along the Tijuana River, just where the river crosses the border into the U.S. And this system basically would capture river water at the upstream side, would kind of treat the contaminated water with ozone bubbles, basically. That system, technically, scientifically, the ozone, bombarding that contaminated water with ozone ends up killing a lot of that bacteria that causes the hydrogen sulfide sewer gas odors and causes the contamination in the water itself. Um, so at a technical scientific level, using ozone to treat bacteria to get rid of bacteria in the water is workable, but unfortunately there are other potential unintended risks that can happen from that. The main risk we have here in the Tijuana River is that we don't know what other kinds of contamination are in the water, right? We know there are industrial chemicals. We know there's some heavy metals. So um, we don't entirely know how the nano bubbler system would treat those. Is it going to cause a bigger air release of those contaminants in aerosolized form? A lot of unanswered questions there. And unfortunately, the government, when they rolled out this program, uh, didn't do that kind of testing. They didn't ask themselves those kinds of questions. So they put the system in the riverbed. They were using it. We still haven't seen the data from that system, but essentially, about a month after it was in place, we had a big rainstorm they weren't prepared for, and all of that equipment was washed away and destroyed. So you know, we had a kind of a failure of planning and a failure of foresight that's several million dollars in equipment that could have provided us good data about whether this could be a good treatment option was lost. And so I think it remains to be seen whether they will make another try at that. But you know, we think we want to be open to any kind of solution, but if they're going to try new technology, we want to make sure there are uh, not unintended side effects, byproducts, consequences that may cause more problems than they're actually trying to solve. All right, I think we need to wrap up. It is 1 o'clock. It's actually 1:01. Um, so we will follow up. We'll a lot more questions. So we will try to follow up with and answer some of these questions as a follow-up to the webinar. Um, and please contact me again. My email is just Phillip at SD Coastkeeper. I'm happy to answer. We'll get answers out to these questions as quickly as we can over the next few days. And we really appreciate you all joining us today. It's fantastic questions. I hope you all enjoyed this. I hope it was a valuable time for you. And we certainly like to share news about the work we're doing and the amazing partners we have in Tijuana with PFEA. And there's more to come. Our main role in the next couple of years is we're gonna continue to monitor the river. We're gonna continue to be the public watchdog to make sure our government and the Mexican government, as much as we can, are implementing these improvements, are meeting the commitments that on paper they've made to address this issue. So thank you all so much.